All right, and we're back. So if we talk about population, we have to discuss the fact that population is just this aggregate. It covers a lot of people, right? The population of this class. But there are different types within the population. So there are boys and girls, and people who have blonde hair, people who have black hair, and people who live on the north side or the west side or the south side, and those who are Bears fans and those who are Packers fans. There's probably no Packers fans, but different types, right? So think of the things that I listed. Some of those differences are biological. If you have black hair or blonde hair, that's a biological difference, right? If you have blue eyes or brown eyes, or if you are a man or a woman, or I should say, male or female, and that's a biological aspect. But the vast majority are social. So, if I asked you what is your ethnicity, and you said Latino, or European, or Asian, that's a social grouping, right? Your football affiliation or this, okay? And social difference tends to be the dominant type of population differences that we cover. And here's the thing about social differences, they are the product of society, relations that are coded, reinforced, and policed. In other words, you aren't born being Latino. And I know that may sound weird to some people, but the term Latino did not exist in the wild before people decided to give it a term. We give names to things like Latino or Hispanic or Asian, and it's based somewhat on where you were born. But here's an example: um, if somebody born in Egypt, right, and they're Muslim and they have a lighter skin tone, and then there's somebody who's born in Nigeria who's Christian, has a very dark skin tone, and they both move here, are they African American? That depends on who you ask. In the U.S. Census Bureau, African ancestry does not include countries like Egypt or Morocco or Algeria. They're considered part of the Mid Eastern, or Asian actually. So it depends on who you ask. Latino, that's a term that we use now, or Hispanic. 30 years ago, the term wasn't used. So did that mean that 30 years ago there were no Latinos? No, the term then was Chicano. And before that, there wasn't a term that was politically acceptable. So these are social relations. They are created by society and they are coded. And what it means is society decides what it is to be Latino. Think about this question: do you have to speak Spanish to be Latino? So what if your last name is Sanchez and your family has been living in southern Texas for 200 years and you actually don't speak Spanish, but your ancestry is Spanish? Does that make you Latino? Versus somebody who came from Brazil, South America, Catholic, but they speak Portuguese, right? And there's lots of variations on that. So those definitions are created and coded and reinforced by society and policed. So police, another reaction might be if somebody comes from a immigrant group and they have an accent, and maybe they learn to speak with less of an accent. A lot of times they are ostracized, saying that they're trying to be quote unquote white in this country, right? That's a policing of social difference. They can change. What it is to be Latino is changed and it evolves, just like what it is to be black in this country has evolved, and what it is to be white has even evolved. Back in the 1920s, Italian American immigrants were not considered white. They were considered not part of the white population until after World War II. So what it was to be white changed and evolved. Okay, so the sources of these are: one, gender, and let me be upfront about this: gender is not the same as sex. So being born biologically, a man or a woman or intersex, depends on your DNA and your chromosomes. But gender is the values that we assign. So what it means to be a woman varies from culture to culture. What is woman's work? What is the role of a woman? What is it to be manly or masculine? And that's gender. And that's a cultural decision. We'll talk about that more in a bit. Age, right? uh, Baby boomers, Generation X, Generation Y, younger, older. That's a major source of it. And then the last one is race and ethnicity. And we assign a lot of value based on that, don't we? So let's talk about gender, right? So gender again is the values that we assign based on biological sex. In other words, a woman's place is in the home. Men are to be the breadwinner. Those are things that are assigned based on your sex, but they have nothing to do with your biological activity. Women are just as capable of being the main source of income for a family as they are as taking care of children, right? But this affects space and place geographically. Women and men, biologically speaking, maybe not so much, but gender-wise, very differently occupy space. In some countries, women are not allowed to leave the house if they are unless they are in the company of a married male relative. They must wear covering from head to toe, and that is how women's roles are viewed in those countries. Well, if you can't leave the home without a male escort, you are covered from head to toe. And in some countries, like Saudi Arabia, could not legally drive until 5 years ago. You're definitely going to occupy space much differently, right? And these distinctions often are tied to or part of cultural identity, right? So oftentimes in this country, when we think of people who are Muslim, we have this image of what the women look like and what the men look like based on, cultural distinctions. It isn't always correct, but that's how we kind of make that connection. And some cultures view it in different ways as well. And then in the economy, we talked a little bit before about economic disparity, the idea of the domestic economy, right? Some roles, some economic actions definitely have gender coding involved. Even though in this country, for instance, it's technically illegal, men are still paid on average $1 to every 70 cents a woman makes. Predominantly in the service industry, the low end service jobs, the people that work the counters at McDonald's, the daycare workers, the vast majority are women. Whereas when you look at the executives, the people at the top of the service economy, the executives, the chairmen of the board, the people that run the corporations, those are almost dominantly men. And so gender does play a role in that. And it varies across public to private. A lot of times there's this talk about the idea of, women can have it all. They can be the leader of their company, they can run for president, but at the same time, they have to be different when they're home to be the mother and the grandmother and the caretaker. And there's this kind of discrepancy. And the same thing for men. Until recently, in this country, men weren't really expected to be the main caregivers. And now, more and more, you see that they are. And this changes over time. So this is a poster for World War II. And if you don't know who this is, she's Rosie the Riveter. In the 1940s, as most of America's young men went off to fight in the war, we still needed people to work in the factories to make the tanks and the fighter planes and the bullets and the bombs. And so the government encouraged women to go get jobs in the factory. Because before then, factory work was too tough for women. That was men's work. Women were supposed to stay home. But Rosie the Riveter said, you know what? We can do this. We are tough. And this whole campaign to make this socially acceptable for women to work and work in factory jobs. And they did quite well, very well. What's interesting is that after the war, all the men come home. And what happened to the women factory workers? They were all let go because they were just holding those jobs for the men. And there was really no huge outcry about this because at the time, that was the gender role of women. Women were to be the homemaker. And they were basically just those were men's jobs. And they were there when they came back. I mean, today, that'd be an outcry, right? So in the space of 5 years, we go from women being, stay at home, wear your dresses, make cookies, to being riveters and welders and making cars and tanks, to going back to being in the house. Okay. So women in the economy have very different roles in this country and in many countries, right? We do know this. In service economies and in peasant economies, women tend to work more. Now, the service economy we kind of touched upon. Service jobs like childcare, house cleaning, food preparation, those tend to be viewed as female jobs anyway. And so there's a lot of that. But in peasant economies, a lot of people who work on, live on their own farm and grow their own food. For extra money, the woman will go and work in a shop selling their produce during the day. Okay? But women often find themselves in many economies in what they call the double bind. That not only are they expected to be part of the formal economy and get a job and work and pay, but they're still expected in many parts to be the main domestic worker. In other words, that it's still up to Dr. Mom to take care of the sick kids. It's still up to the wife to take care of the children, more so than the father. Okay? And especially in what we call patriarchal societies. Societies where you see male privilege, right? Patriarchal is male based or male dominant. In patriarchal societies, women tend to be put into roles, gender roles, where they are protected from what they call the male gaze. This idea that women must be protected, right? So the most obvious example is countries where women have to wear, head coverings and face coverings to cover themselves. In some countries, also women must stay indoors unless they leave with a male relative, and that is common in a lot of Islamic countries, and that's the most common one. But in our country, one of the reasons why women were expected to stay home and take care of the children was that they were to be there for their man and keep the house and stay out of the, women that were out going out and doing their own job. They were viewed as loose or too promiscuous almost, in the sense they were being too available for the male gaze. So I'm not going to do this class experiment, close your eyes, because we're not in class and it'd be kind of weird. So we're going to leave that there and head on to the next slide. This map just shows you the amount of women as a percentage in the labor force. And you can see that the highest percentage tends to be these very poor countries in Africa and Asia, right here, where either A, they're working in factories building iPhones and electronics, or on their farm. The lowest rate, below 35, so that's right through here. And before I tell you what it is, I want you to kind of think, what do you think would be the cause? Why would there be so few women working in these countries? And I'll tell you right now, this is also where these countries are the heart of the Muslim world. These are mostly Muslim majority countries. So in a lot of countries, if it's not the law that women have to stay home, it's kind of a cultural thing. Age is another way we populations age, and how we categorize people differently. What stage of life are you at? And they can vary. So let's talk about children. Up until the 1930s, it was completely acceptable for children as young as 12 or 10 or 11 to go get a job in the factory, especially if you were a poor family. It wasn't until the Great Depression that we had the first laws stopping this. And it wasn't so much because we didn't want children to work as it was if there were less children working, there'd be more work for the out of work adults. That was actually the basis for that. But today, it's evolved to the point now where most of you in this class are probably either living at home or living close to your parents because you're in school. 15, 20, maybe 30 years ago, if you were 18, you left the house, you got a job, and you supported yourself. Now, college is seen as essential as high school. In fact, I think in any ways, I think that the first 2 years of college are going to become as common and as important as the last 2 years of high school. And if that's the case, it's very expensive to do this. Most people still live at home. And so we've seen that has changed the idea of what it is to be an adult. You're still legally an adult at 18, but there's no longer this huge stigma of being 19 years old and living at home if you're going to school. Okay? And then also, at what age do you become a parent? In this country, in the United States, in the 1960s, the average age of a woman when she had her first child was 21, and today it's 26. That's the average age. In some countries, it's still 18 or younger. We see here in some countries in Asia. In Japan, it's now in the 30s. So the idea of how old you have to be a parent, that's changed. And that goes in large part to different cultural aspects. In Japan, people are marrying later in life because they are working so much and going to school. They're putting off that. The same reason that many people in the United States are having children later. It's just socially acceptable to go out, go to school, begin and develop a career first. So race and ethnicity. I'm going to pause this one here. This is kind of a long one. So I'm going to pause this. We'll come back with part 3 in just a little bit.